Chapter 1. The rain in the lower sectors was a greasy chemical mist that tasted of static and old metal. I had the debtor pinned against a corrugated steel wall that vibrated with the hum of the ark's ventilation turbines. He was a small man, folded too many times, wearing a coat with more patches than original fabric. "The math is simple, Elias," I said, my voice sounding like two bricks rubbing together. "You missed the lunar cycle payment, then the grace period. Now, the Gilded Root Bank doesn't want your credits, they want the collateral." Elias shifted, his heels slipping on the slick pavement. His wide, wet eyes reflected the flickering magenta neon of a nearby noodle shop. "1 week, Kaelen. Just 1 week. I've got a lead on a salvage job in the static drift. I can triple the arrears." I didn't answer. I felt the heavy boredom that had settled into my marrow after 20 years of this. I pulled the extraction needle from my breast pocket, a silver filament shimmering with a predatory light. The tool didn't just take a soul. It took ambition, the belief that tomorrow might actually be better. It was the only currency the bank valued because it never depreciated. "I don't do salvage leads," I said. "I do collections." "Please," he whispered. "I have a daughter in the mid-spires. If I lose my drive, I'm just a shell. I won't be able to work the vents." A flicker of memory, my own desperation from a lifetime ago, tugged at me. I paused, the needle hovering an inch from his sternum. The hesitation lasted 3 seconds. In this city, 3 seconds of mercy usually cost you your teeth. "The bank doesn't lend to daughters," I said. I stepped in, the smell of cheap synthetic cologne mixing with wet iron. With a clinical flick of the wrist, I drove the needle home. There was no scream, just a sharp intake of breath. I watched the filament fill with an iridescent vapor the color of a bruised sunset. Elias didn't collapse, he just slumped, his gaze turning vacant and flat. He wasn't dead, just empty. I capped the needle and left him leaning against the wall like discarded furniture. Returning to the Gilded Root headquarters was like ascending into a different dimension. The lower sectors were rust and desperation, the headquarters was white marble, floating geometries, and sterilized silence. My boots clicked on the polished floor, the weight of the vial in my pocket reminding me this was my final hit. I had spent 2 decades as the bank's most efficient bloodhound, playing by the rules and keeping my head down. I was expecting the prize, a gold-plated retirement watch and a pension for a quiet pod in the upper spires where the air didn't taste like a battery leak. I wanted to disappear into synthetic scotch and total silence. The chief clerk, a man with parchment skin and thick rectangular lenses, didn't look up as I approached. He simply slid a piece of cream-colored cardstock across the obsidian counter. It wasn't a watch or a check. It was a legal summons, embossed with the gold seal of the High Probate Court. I instinctively touched my wrist, a ghost habit counting down to a freedom that was suddenly shifting. "What is this?" I asked. "The estate of Caviretti," the clerk rasped. "You are the sole surviving beneficiary of the property known as the Verdant Ledger. You have inherited the assets, the titles, and the accompanying obligations." I stared at the paper. Cavi. My uncle. The man had vanished into the static drift 15 years ago, leaving a trail of unpaid taxes and a reputation as a lunatic who talked to plants. I hadn't spoken to him since I was a cadet. "I don't want it," I said, sliding the paper back. "Liquidate it. I'm retiring." The clerk looked up, a mirthless smile touching his lips. "I'm afraid that is not an option. The property is a blood-bound trust. Under Gilded Root bylaws, the inheritance is a mandatory transfer. If you decline the asset, the associated debts, which are substantial, transfer immediately to your personal account as a primary liability. You can own the farm, or you can owe the bank for the farm. Either way, you are no longer retired." A cold stone dropped in my stomach. The bank didn't give gifts, they only redesigned the way they owned you. I took the summons and left without another word. 2 hours later I was descending into the hydroponic slums. I left the marble for a world of dripping pipes and humming bioreactors. The air was thick and humid, smelling of rotting algae and static. It was the kind of place where hope was liquidated for parts. I followed the coordinates to the edge of the sector where the architecture became erratic. Tucked between a synth meat shop and a pile of decommissioned server racks was a dilapidated greenhouse, its glass panels clouded and cracked. A fence of repurposed scrap metal and wiring surrounded the perimeter, looking as if it had been designed by a madman during a fever dream. I pushed the gate open with a metal-sharp shriek. As I stepped inside, the smell shifted to clover and wet earth, undercut by something electric. It wasn't a peaceful garden. The interior was a riot of iridescent dust that hung in the air like frozen glitter. Standing in a patch of glowing blue grass were llamas. They weren't grazing, they were standing in a semicircle, humming in a complex, syncopated harmony that sounded like a midnight jazz club. One larger beast, with a theatrical toss of its wool, looked at me with profound judgment. I walked toward the potting shed, my boots crunching on shimmering dust. Pinned to the wood with a rusted nail was a legal notice of final foreclosure. I read the fine print, and my heart slowed to a heavy thud. The property wasn't just behind on payments, it was in arrears for 3 centuries. The interest alone defied common sense. This wasn't an inheritance, it was a spiritual sinkhole designed to swallow whoever was unlucky enough to be a ready. As I stood there, a loud, brassy blast of a trumpet echoed through the greenhouse, though no instrument was visible. One of the llamas had just hit a high C, and as he did, the gravity shifted, lifting my feet 2 inches off the ground. Chapter 2. Chapter title, Rhythmic Anarchy. The gravity snapped back with the subtlety of a falling anvil. I hit the dirt hard, the wind leaving my lungs in a wheeze like a punctured accordion. Before I could wipe the iridescent dust from my palms, a brassy discordant blast ripped through the barn. The trumpet hum was so violent it felt like a physical shove, sending me sprawling backward into a pile of rusted hydroponic trays. I stayed there, staring up at the cracked glass ceiling where the ark's core filtered through in sickly yellow stripes. As the echo died, a shadow fell over me. I looked up to see a llama designed by a costume designer with a grudge against minimalism. He stood in a theatrical pose, one hoof delicately poised, his wool groomed into a sweeping dramatic crest. He tossed his head with a flourish, spraying shimmering dust over my suit. He didn't speak in words, but in a rhythmic, haughty series of bleats and resonant hums. It wasn't animal noise, it was a critique. The cadence was clear. You are a stiff, monochromatic smudge on a vibrant canvas. I've dealt with screaming soul debtors and celestial auditors who spoke in mathematical proofs, but I had never been judged by a camelid with a sense of timing. Look, whatever your name is, I said, pushing myself up and brushing off my lapels. My voice sounded flat and gray against the humming vibrancy of the room. I'm the new owner, or the new victim. Either way, we need ground rules. First rule, no more sonic booms while I'm assessing the damage. Balthazar, as I would later learn he was called, responded with a sharp bleat that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He stepped closer, his liquid eyes scanning me with clinical detachment. He let out a low, vibrating hum that resonated in my teeth, suggesting I lacked the rhythmic capacity to even stand in his presence without offending the air. He was a virtuoso who viewed my existence as a rhythmic failure. I sighed and pulled out a digital slate. Right. Asset list. If I'm going to stop the bank from scrubbing this place off the map, I need to know what I'm working with. Number of heads, health status, dietary requirements, and, the moment the word assets left my lips, the atmosphere shifted. The other llamas, who had been lounging in the shadows like oversized velvet cushions, snapped into formation. In a synchronized burst, they unleashed a sonic wall, a complex, improvisational wave of harmony and dissonance that hit me like a tidal wave of hot air. It was a physical barrier of sound that pushed me backward until I hit the barn wall with a dull thud. I gasped for air, my vision swimming. They weren't just humming, they were protesting. To them, my corporate lexicon, assets, lists, requirements, wasn't just boring, it was oppressive. It was a void where music should be. Balthazar looked at me with profound disappointment and let out a short, clipped hum, informing me that my soul was as flat as a ledger page. Then the music stopped. The silence was broken by the sterile click of high-end heels on concrete. Standing in the doorway was a man carved out of surgical steel, Van Huynh. He wore a charcoal suit that cost more than the entire hydroponic sector, his silhouette sharp enough to cut glass. He watched the barn, his lip curling in disgust as he stepped over a puddle of nutrient sludge. He adjusted his cufflinks with an obsessive flick of the wrist, then finally shifted his gaze to me. Kaelen, he said. His voice was a sterile instrument, devoid of warmth and surgically precise. I see the Gilded Root has decided to reward your years of service with a plunge into the abyss. A poetic choice, though statistically inefficient. Thornshire, I grunted, leaning against the wall to hide my shaking legs. I didn't know the bank sent out welcoming committees for spiritual sinkholes. Thon didn't smile. He raised a hand, and a holographic ledger shimmered into existence, a cascade of gold and crimson data streaming through the air. His fingers danced over the projections with supernatural speed, performing a spiritual audit in real time. I watched the colors shift from gold to a deep, bruising purple. The resonance of this facility is in total collapse, Thon stated, his eyes fixed on the data. The harmonic balance is practically inverted. According to RootNet Clause 4.12, the bank maintains the right to immediate liquidation if the spiritual equity falls below the threshold of viability. This farm is no longer a viable entity. It is a vacuum. I just got here, I said, stepping forward, trying to channel the man who could talk a debtor out of their last glimmer of hope. Give me a grace period. I can restructure the debt, pivot the output. Just a few weeks to stabilize the resonance. Thon stopped. He studied me, and for a second I saw a flicker of the protege he had been before he traded his humanity for a promotion in auditing. He adjusted his cufflinks again. The smirk that touched his lips was thin and cold. The time for restructuring ended 3 centuries ago, Kaelen. However, as a courtesy to our former mentor, I will grant a singular extension. You have exactly 1 lunar cycle to produce a verified harmonized balance sheet. If you fail, the farm and every sentient organism within its perimeter will be liquidated. The RootNet requires the space for a server hub. Your llamas are merely noise in the system. He closed the hologram with a sharp flick of his wrist and turned on his heel, leaving the scent of static and expensive cologne in his wake. I stood in the sudden quiet, the weight of the debt like a stone in my gut. I looked at Balthazar. The llama was watching me, his head tilted, his expression unreadable. I sank to my knees to catch my breath, and as I did, my hand brushed against a loose slab of concrete in the floor. I paused. There was a vibration beneath the stone, not the chaotic hum of the llamas, but a steady, rhythmic pulse. I pried the slab back a few inches, and a sliver of silver light escaped, pulsing like a slow, metal-sharp heartbeat in the dark. Chapter 3. I plunged my hands into the bowl of lunar-dust, and for a second it felt like dipping my fingers into a vat of liquid starlight. It was cold. Not the cold of a freezer, but the vacuum chill of deep space that makes your marrow ache. I didn't have time for the aesthetics of the medium. I had a deadline from a man who viewed human empathy as a rounding error, and I had a floor that needed to be turned into a legal document before the Gilded Root Bank decided to scrub this sector from the map. I knelt on the concrete, the grit of the barn floor grinding into my knees. I began to scribe. I didn't do art, I did balance sheets. I started with a rigid vertical line to separate assets from liabilities, my movements precise, sterile, and devoid of any flourish. I wanted a corporate ledger, a clean set of columns that would tell Thon Hun Nguyen the farm was viable. But as the silver dust hit the floor, it didn't settle. It shivered. The line I drew didn't stay a line. It began to vibrate, the edges blurring into jagged, electric fractals. Then the dust snapped. A bolt of arcane energy, white-hot and smelling of static crackle, surged up my arms. It wasn't a shock, it was a rejection. The force threw me backward, my spine connecting with the corrugated metal wall with a sound like a slammed car door. I slid down to the floor, gasping, my forearms tingling with a numb, static heat that made my skin feel 2 sizes too small. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, staring at the floor. The line I'd drawn had turned into a scorched scar on the concrete, a blackened streak that looked like a scream. I didn't stay down. I crawled back to the bowl, my breath coming in dry, ragged hitches. I tried again, my voice dropping into that desperate, low monotone I used when I was trying to convince a debtor that their soul was worth more to me than to the void. Just stay put, I muttered, my fingers trembling as I gripped another handful of the shimmering grit. Align. Balance. Stabilize. I tried to force the dust into a series of neat, bureaucratic boxes. I pushed my will into the medium, demanding it obey the laws of accounting. The dust responded by mutating. Instead of boxes, it formed jagged, aggressive spikes that began to burrow into the floorboards. They weren't letters or numbers, they were teeth. The silver shards gnawed into the concrete, emitting a high-pitched, metal-sharp screech that set my teeth on edge. The more I pushed, the deeper the spikes sank, eating the very foundation of the barn in a fit of geometric rage. You're shouting at a mirror and wondering why it won't tell you the weather, a voice drifted across the room. I looked up. Zenzi Lembeki was leaning against a rusted support pipe, her fingers dancing a complex, syncopated polyrhythm against the metal. Tea-tap, tap, tap. Tap. The sound was a sharp contrast to the screeching dust. She studied me with an expression that was half pity and half amusement, her eyes tracking the chaotic spikes I'd managed to conjure. "I'm trying to write a balance sheet," I snapped, wiping a smudge of silver grit from my forehead. "I'm trying to save this place from being turned into a server hub." "You're trying to speak a language of mathematics to a medium that only understands music," Senziel said, stepping forward. Her movements were fluid, almost drifting, as if she were hearing a melody I was deaf to. "The lunar dust isn't ink, Kaelen. It's a living vibration. It doesn't care about your columns or your liabilities. It cares about resonance. You're treating it like a calculator, but it's a cello." I scoffed, the sound a dry rattle in my throat. "Jazz accounting." "Right. I've spent 20 years collecting souls for the root. I know how to handle volatile assets. I don't need a music lesson." "That's your problem," she said, her voice shifting into a melodic, rhythmic cadence. "You think you're the conductor, but you're just noise. Look at them." She pointed a long finger toward the herd. Balthazar and the other llamas weren't just humming. They were locked in a tight, interlocking harmonic structure. It was a low, pulsing drone that felt like it was vibrating in the soles of my boots. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I stopped trying to calculate. I listened. Underneath the humming, there was a pattern, a series of rises and falls that mirrored the ebb and flow of a ledger. The llamas weren't just making noise, they were calculating. The humming was a living spreadsheet, a complex set of financial equations translated into a frequency that the very air seemed to support. I am a dead man, I thought, a sudden spike of vertigo hitting me. I can negotiate a contract with a demon in a sulfur pit. I can navigate the labyrinth of the Gilded Root's bylaws without blinking, but I can't hum a tune. I am a rigid, rusted gear in a world that has turned into a symphony. If I can't shift, I'm just a piece of scrap metal waiting for the incinerator. "Try it," Zenziel commanded. "Don't think about the debt. Don't think about then on. Just mimic the beat. Sink your heart to the room." I looked at the bowl of dust, then at the llamas. I tried to find the rhythm. I attempted to hum a simple, steady beat, but my internal rigidity acted like a wall. My voice was flat, a monotone that clashed violently with the rich, resonant drone of the herd. I felt the tension in my shoulders, the habit of a lifetime spent in sterile offices and cold recovery zones. The dust reacted instantly. It didn't spark this time. Instead, it erupted in a sudden, shimmering fountain, manifesting a shower of tiny, perfect gold coins. For a heartbeat, the room looked like a treasury. Then, as quickly as they appeared, the coins vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but the smell of old metal tang and disappointment. "The dust is mocking you," Zenziel said softly. She didn't sound smug, she sounded warned. "The more you fight the rhythm, the more it will drain you. It doesn't just take your energy, Kaelen, it takes your essence. Keep trying to force it, and you'll wake up tomorrow feeling physically hollow, like someone scooped out your insides with a melon baller." I instinctively checked the non-existent watch on my wrist, a phantom habit that flared up whenever I felt the clock ticking. I was wasting time. Every second I spent failing to hum was a second closer to the liquidation date. I looked at the silver light still pulsing beneath the slab I'd uncovered earlier, and then I looked at Balthazar. The alpha llama shifted his weight, his head tilting. Suddenly, the humming changed. The upbeat, calculating drone dropped into a slow, mournful dirge. It was a sound of profound loss, a sonic weight that seemed to pull at my very soul, dragging my cynicism down into a deep, dark well of grief. It felt like every failure I'd ever suppressed was being played back to me in a minor key. Zenziel's expression turned solemn. She stopped tapping the pipe. "Your uncle didn't just leave you a farm and a pile of debt, Kaelen. Kavi was a master of the mnemonic bridge. He didn't write his secrets in a book, he wove them into the music of the herd." I looked at her, the vibration of the dirge still rattling my ribs. "What secrets?" "A code," she whispered. "A harmonic sequence that can override the rootnet's foreclosure protocols, a way to erase the debt entirely. But it's hidden in the dissonance. To find it, you have to stop being a collector and start being a part of the song." As she spoke, the silver light beneath the floor slab flared, pulsing in perfect time with the llama's mournful song, as if something beneath the concrete was waiting for the right note to wake up. Chapter 4. Chapter title, The Gravity of Improvisation. Balthazar didn't just want my respect, he wanted my submission. He stood in the center of the hydroponic bay, wool shimmering under flickering sodium lights like a bad disco ball. He let out a sharp, high-pitched bleat, like a slide whistle falling down a flight of stairs, followed by a deep, resonant hum that vibrated in my boots. In the llama world, you don't file a grievance with HR, you engage in a rhythmic duel. He's offering a sonic wager, Zenziel said, her fingers drumming 7/8 time on a rusted nutrient vat. If you hold the beat, you set the schedule. If you break, the herd decides when they work, which is to say, they don't. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, fighting a tension headache. I did balance sheets and soul reclamation notices, not wagers. But looking at the herd, I saw a dozen expectant eyes waiting for me to crumble. If I couldn't establish order, the root net would liquidate us before the first lunar cycle ended. I stepped into the circle of silver lunar dust. I didn't know jazz, but I knew the relentless cadence of a corporate office, the click of a keyboard, the hum of an air purifier, the precise interval of a quarterly review. I closed my eyes and channeled that rigidity. I began to stomp my heel into the dust, a hard, metronomic beat. 1, 2, 3, 4. It was a bureaucrat's march, a sonic manifestation of a filing cabinet. I wanted to box him in, forcing the chaos of the farm into a linear structure where I held the stopwatch. For a moment, it worked. The llamas shifted, bobbing in reluctant synchronization. The lunar dust began to swirl into neat geometric columns and rows, as if the floor were transforming into a giant spreadsheet. I felt a surge of smug satisfaction. I was bringing the Gilded Root's efficiency to the slums. Then Balthazar decided he'd had enough of the grid. He unleashed a sonic ambush, a jagged, syncopated rip that tore through my beat like a chainsaw through drywall. He began to pivot, hooves dancing across the silver dust in shimmering arcs. He took my rigid 4/4 time and fractured it, sliding into a polyrhythmic frenzy that turned my ledger into avant-garde art. The dust bloomed into iridescent spirals and lightning bolts of calligraphy that defied every law of accounting I'd ever learned. "He's deconstructing your narrative," Zenziel cheered. "He's turning your audit into a symphony." I tried to double down, stomping harder to crush the dissonance with volume. But Balthazar used my rigidity as a foil, making his flourishes sound even more daring. He was leading me toward a cliff of absolute sonic anarchy, and for a split second I felt the temptation to just let go. Emboldened, Balthazar attempted a daring improvisational leap. He hit a piercing, soaring note intended to cap the performance with a flourish of total liberation. But he slipped. He missed the harmonic resolution by a fraction of a semitone. It was a wrong note, not just musically, but mathematically. In the world of lunar dust calligraphy, a misplaced note is the equivalent of dividing by 0. The reaction was instantaneous. A violent snap of arcane energy rippled through the room, and gravity simply quit. I was launched upward, colliding with the corrugated metal ceiling with a bone-jarring thud. Around me, the llamas floated like oversized woolly balloons, paddling uselessly. Hydroponic trays inverted, sending nutrient-rich water and lettuce leaves drifting in shimmering globes. The architecture warped as the dust reacted to the mathematical error. I clung to a ceiling beam, fingers slipping on cold metal. Balthazar drifted nearby, his theatrical pose replaced by sheer terror as he spun in the weightless void. The air tasted of static and wet lettuce. "Stabilize it," Zenziel yelled, gripping a support pillar. "The dissonance is too high." "You have to sync with him, Kaelen, or the room will collapse into a singularity." I looked at Balthazar. I hated him, but I hated the idea of being crushed into a spiritual pancake more. I reached out, grabbing his thick wool and pulling him close. I couldn't stomp in 0G, so I used my voice. I didn't try to be the boss, I tried to be the anchor. I started a low, steady drone, a grounding frequency that mirrored the ship's engines. Balthazar caught the frequency. He stopped spinning and hummed along, his tone shifting from arrogant to desperate. Together, we created a stabilizing chord, a reluctant partnership born of mutual catastrophe. The vibration pushed against the warped gravity, and slowly, the world righted itself. The water globes splashed back into their trays, and we plummeted. I hit the concrete hard, the impact knocking the wind out of me. Balthazar landed beside me, his wool matted with slime. He didn't toss his head or strike a pose. He just lay there breathing hard. He had seen the void, and the void had been a mathematical error. Just as the silence settled, a piercing, rhythmic wail sliced through the air. A sector patrol siren. The gravity inversion had created a sonic bloom. A spiritual flare visible to any rootnet sensor within 3 decks. If the patrol found sentient, jazz-playing llamas and a disgraced soul collector in a closed-off farm, we'd be dissected. "They're coming," Zenziel whispered. I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the ache in my ribs. I reached for the remaining pouch of lunar dust. I didn't try to write a ledger or a song. I threw the powder into the air and envisioned a void. A great, yawning silence. I poured every ounce of my cynical, bureaucratic desire to be invisible into the dust, forcing it to wrap around the farm like a soundproof blanket. I muted our signature just as the shadow of the patrol ship swept over the translucent roof. We held our breath, listening to the engines pass overhead. The silence lasted an eternity, then faded. As I leaned back against a beam to catch my breath, I noticed a small, yellowed scrap of paper dislodged by the gravity flip. I plucked it from the rafters. It was my Uncle Cobby's handwriting, jagged and airy, as if the ink itself were vibrating. I read the single sentence, and a coldness settled in my gut that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. The bank isn't auditing the farm, they're hunting the dust. Chapter 5. The neon sump didn't just smell like static crackle and desperation. It smelled like a wet dog that had been rolled in conductive solder. I stepped off the transit lift and immediately felt the humidity cling to my skin like a cheap suit. Above, the holographic rain fell in shimmering, jagged lines of magenta and teal, passing through the pedestrians without wetting them, a digital ghost of a storm that never actually broke. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, the skin already raw from a day of dealing with jazz-playing livestock, and checked my wrist for a watch that had been stripped from me 3 foreclosures ago. Habit is a cruel master. I pushed through the crowd of rootnet fugitives, gaunt things with optic nerves replaced by flickering fiber optics, and headed for the velvet void. The club was less of a venue and more of a sensory assault. The music wasn't just sound, it was a thick, iridescent haze that vibrated in the marrow of my teeth. It was the kind of place where you could lose your soul and your wallet in the same transaction, and nobody would notice until the lights came up. The air was heavy with the scent of synthetic lotus and the sharp tang of illegal capacitors. I navigated the dance floor, where patrons moved in slow, disjointed arcs, their silhouettes blurred by the pulsing neon. Soraya dos Santos sat in a booth carved from a single piece of obsidian glass, looking like the only thing in the room that wasn't fraying at the edges. She was chewing a piece of iridescent, glowing gum, blowing a bubble that expanded into a shimmering sphere of violet light before popping with a soft, wet snap. She didn't stand when I approached. She just tilted her head, her eyes tracking me with a predatory sort of curiosity. "Kaelen," she said, her voice a low, melodic drawl that sounded like it had been dragged through 3 different ship sectors. "You look like you've been chewed up and spat out by a faulty ventilation shaft. What brings a Gilded Root lapdog to the sump? Come to collect the debt from the ghosts?" "I need lunar dust," I said, keeping my voice flat. I didn't want her to smell the panic. Off-book. High purity. And I need it yesterday. Soraya let out a slow, humming laugh and blew another bubble. "Dust is a luxury item these days, honey. Ever since Don Juan rolled into the sector with his spiritual audit and his sterile cufflinks, the market has gone sideways. Price has tripled. Supply has vanished into the rootnet's black holes. You're not just asking for powder, you're asking for a miracle." I leaned in, the neon lights reflecting in the glass of the table. "I can't pay the market rate, Soraya." "Not yet." "Then you're in the wrong neighborhood," she replied, her tone shifting to something sharper. She paused, the glowing gum shifting to a deep crimson. "Unless, of course, you've still got those old Gilded Root credentials. The ones that can bypass the encrypted layers of the rootnet." "I want a decrypted packet of server data from the central hub. Specifically, the logistics logs for the hydroponic sectors. You get me the data, I get you the dust. A fair trade for a man with nothing left to lose." I hated the idea. Using my old credentials was like leaving a trail of breadcrumbs for a wolf, but I didn't have a choice. The farm was a sinking ship, and I was the only one trying to plug the holes with jazz and calligraphy. I pulled out my handheld terminal. The casing cracked and greasy. I slid into the rootnet, the interface flooding my vision with a cascade of gold and silver geometries. The network felt cold, a sterile labyrinth of logic and bureaucracy that I had once called home. As I navigated the encrypted layers, searching for Soraya's logistics logs, a hidden file flickered in the periphery of my vision. It was tagged with a high-level administrative seal, the kind of seal that doesn't exist unless the board wants something buried. Curiosity is a dangerous trait in a bailiff, but I've always been bad at following the rules. I cracked the file, and the data streamed into my mind like a cold shower. It wasn't a logistics log. It was a sabotage directive. The Gilded Root Board hadn't just sent Thon to audit the farm. They had been intentionally throttling the nutrient supply to the hydroponic beds for months. They were starving the llamas, weakening their spiritual resonance to make the foreclosure inevitable. The debt wasn't the point. The balance sheet was a fiction. They wanted the farm to fail so they could seize the land and convert the sector into a high-yield server hub for the rootnet. It was a corporate land grab disguised as a financial recovery. I felt a sudden, sharp pressure in my chest, a physical weight that made it hard to breathe. I wasn't just fighting a debt, I was fighting a scripted execution. I closed the file and transferred the requested logs to Soraya, my fingers trembling slightly on the keys. Soraya watched me, her expression unreadable. She reached under the table and slid a heavy, lead-lined canister toward me. "You've got that look, Kaelen. The look of a man who just found out the game is rigged." "They're killing the farm," I whispered, rubbing my nose. "They aren't looking for payment. They're just waiting for the animals to drop so they can pave over the soil." Soraya leaned forward, the violet glow of her gum illuminating the sharp lines of her face. "It's more than just the land, Kaelen. Word in the sump is that the board is hunting for something buried beneath the farm's soil. Something Kavi found and hid before he vanished into the static. The dust is just the bait. The server hub is just the cover. They want whatever your uncle tucked away in the dirt." I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just grabbed the canister and walked out of the club, the iridescent music following me like a bad memory. I felt the weight of the lunar dust in my hand, but it felt less like a solution and more like a countdown. I wasn't a soul collector anymore. I was a target in a war I didn't understand. By the time I reached the farm, the adrenaline had worn off, leaving me hollow and exhausted. But as I approached the perimeter, the exhaustion vanished, replaced by a cold, piercing dread. The security fence, the one I had spent 3 hours reinforcing with makeshift wards, had been sliced open. Not cut, not broken, but surgically removed, the edges of the metal glowing with a sterile silver cauterization. Professional rootnet operatives. I sprinted toward the barn, my boots splashing through the hydroponic runoff. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocating. The llamas weren't playing. They weren't humming. They were huddled together in the center of the room, a mass of shivering wool and wide, terrified eyes. Balthazar was at the front, his head low, a low, mournful vibration humming in his throat that sounded like a funeral dirge. In the exact center of the barn, where the lunar dust had once been scattered in rhythmic patterns, sat a single, sterile silver briefcase. It was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the dim light of the barn. There was no note, no demand, and no one in sight. Just the briefcase, sitting there like a tombstone for everything I had tried to build. I looked at the llamas, then at the case, and realized the boundary between my two lives hadn't just cracked. It had shattered completely. Chapter 6. The silver briefcase was still there, reflecting the barn's dim amber light like a polished tooth, but I couldn't bring myself to touch it. Not yet. The air in the barn tasted of static crackle and wet wool, and the llamas were still vibrating, a low, collective hum that felt like a migraine behind my eyes. I wanted to open the case, to find some leverage, some secret weapon my Uncle Kabi had left behind, but the sound of a sterile, rhythmic click echoed from the perimeter. Thonwyn didn't walk so much as he glided, his polished oxfords barely disturbing the hydroponic runoff. He looked as if he had been vacuum-sealed into his suit, every crease a calculated decision. In his right hand, he held a holographic projector that cast a cold blue ledger into the humid air. The light was surgical, stripping the warmth from the barn and turning the llama's wool into a ghostly pallid gray. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the animals. He simply stared at the blue numbers drifting in the air, his eyes scanning the data with a precision that made my skin crawl. "The midterm audit begins now," Than said. His voice was a flat line, devoid of the peaks and valleys of human inflection. He adjusted his left cufflink, a small, gold-plated gear that rotated with a faint mechanical whir. "You have one lunar cycle to prove viability, Kaelen. I suggest you present your evidence of fiscal harmonization immediately." I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling the grit of the sump beneath my fingertips. I stepped aside, gesturing toward Balthazar. "The herd has been working. Zenzil has been guiding them. It's not a standard spreadsheet, but the math is there. It's in the rhythm." Balthazar didn't need a second invitation. He stepped forward, his head held high, tossing his wool with a flourish that would have been comical if the stakes weren't so high. He let out a sharp, piercing bleat that acted as a conductor's baton. Suddenly, the barn exploded into sound. The other llamas joined in, not with a song, but with a complex, syncopated architecture of humming and rhythmic stomping. Zenzal stood by the perimeter, her fingers tapping a rapid polyrhythm against a rusted support beam. She was in her element, her eyes closed, guiding the herd through a masterpiece of improvisational accounting. The lunar dust on the floor began to react, swirling into intricate, shimmering geometries. It wasn't just art, it was a living balance sheet. I could see the credits and debits flowing in golden spirals, the debts being offset by harmonic frequencies, the interest rates collapsing under the weight of a perfectly timed crescendo. It was mathematically flawless, a symphony of solvency that should have silenced any auditor in the sector. For 3 minutes, the barn was a cathedral of sound and light. The llamas reached a fever pitch, Balthazar hitting a note so resonant it made the silver briefcase vibrate against the floor. Then, with a final crashing stomp that sent a cloud of lunar dust billowing upward, the music stopped. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant, and thick with the smell of static crackle. Thon Hunwen didn't blink. He didn't even look at the golden spiral still fading into the dirt. He studied his blue holographic ledger, then back at the herd. "Unrecognizable," he said. I felt a surge of heat climb my neck. Unrecognizable? Did you see the geometry, Thon? The math was perfect. The synchronization was absolute. It's the most accurate ledger this farm has produced in a decade. Accuracy is not the metric of the Gilded Root, Thon replied, his voice remaining a monotone. He stepped forward, the blue light of his projector washing over my boots. The bank requires sterile evidence, standardized formats, legible entries. What you have presented is avant-garde. It is a performance, not a record. In the eyes of the board, this is noise, not accounting. It fails to meet the minimum threshold for spiritual evidence. "You're moving the goalposts," I snapped, my voice echoing in the hollow barn. "You know, as well as I do, that the lunar dust only functions through harmonic resonance. You can't expect a standard CSV file from a herd of jazz-loving llamas." Thon finally looked at me, his expression as vacant as a fresh hard drive. "I am not interested in the mechanics of your failure, Kaelen. I am interested in the contract." He tapped a command into his projector, and a new document scrolled into view. A dense, sprawling web of fine print that seemed to stretch infinitely. "I noticed you spent very little time reviewing the addendums to your uncle's inheritance, a common mistake for those who prioritize urgency over diligence." I stepped closer, squinting at the shimmering text. My eyes jumped to a section highlighted in a bruised purple hue. I felt a sudden, cold knot form in my stomach. I had skimmed the property laws, the tax liens, and the livestock mandates, but I had missed the collateral shifts clause. It was buried in a subparagraph, written in a font so small it looked like a line of static. "What is this?" I whispered. "The property is in such profound arrears that the land itself is no longer sufficient security for the debt," Fan explained, his finger tracing the line of text with surgical precision. "According to Section 8.4 of the Gilded Root Charter, when a primary asset is deemed non-viable, the liability shifts to the current legal steward. The owner's becomes the primary asset." I stopped breathing. The words didn't make sense until they did. I felt a sudden jarring sensation in the center of my chest, not a pain, but a vacuum. It was as if a plug had been pulled from a socket I hadn't known existed. A chilling void opened up behind my ribs, an emptiness that sucked the warmth out of my blood. I tried to inhale, but the air felt thin, lacking the weight of a soul that belonged to itself. "You can't do that," I gasped, my hand clutching at my shirt. "I just inherited this place. I didn't sign anything." "Your uncle signed it on your behalf as part of the bequest," Thon said. He adjusted his cufflink again. "By accepting the title of the farm, you accepted the liens. As of 3 minutes ago, your soul has been officially signed over as collateral to cover the farm's accumulated interest payments. You are no longer a free agent, Kaelen. You are a piece of property owned by the Gilded Root." The silence in the barn shifted. It was no longer the expectant silence of a performance. It was the oppressive silence of a tomb. I looked over at the llamas. Balthazar had stopped his theatrical posing. His ears were flopped low, and his wide, dark eyes were fixed on me with a look of profound animal recognition. They knew. They could feel the void in me. They realized that the man who had been trying to save them was now just another line item on the same ledger. Zenzile stepped toward me, her hand reaching out to touch my shoulder. "Kaelen? Your frequency, it's gone. You sound like static." I pulled away from her, the cynicism that had been my shield for 20 years suddenly feeling like a lead weight. I sank back against a support beam, sliding down until I hit the cold, damp concrete. I looked at my hands. They looked the same, but they felt distant, as if I were operating a puppet from a long way off. I had spent my life reclaiming souls for the bank, treating people like currency and lives like bad debts. Now, the machine had finally turned its gears in my direction. I wasn't a collector anymore. I was the collection. Thawne Wynn began to retract his holographic display, the blue light vanishing and leaving us in the oppressive amber dimness. He turned toward the exit, but paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Do not mistake this for a finality," he said. "This is merely a hedge. However, be warned, if the final audit at the end of the lunar cycle fails, the bank will not simply close off on the land. Your soul will be partitioned and sold as server processing power for the rootnet. You will spend eternity as a subroutine in a corporate firewall." He walked out, his Oxfords clicking rhythmically against the floor. As the door creaked shut, I looked at the silver briefcase. It sat there, silent and sterile, while the void in my chest pulsed with a rhythmic, freezing cold. I reached out to touch the handle, but as my fingers brushed the metal, a sudden, violent spark jumped from the case to my skin, and for a split second I didn't hear the wind in the vents. I heard my Uncle Kavi's voice, whispering from a place that sounded like a dying radio station. Chapter 7. I woke up to the sound of a radiator screaming and the smell of static crackle. My left hand was gone, not severed. There was no blood, no jagged bone, but it had been replaced by a flickering projection of grayscale television static. I stared at it in the dim amber light of the bedroom, watching the edges of my fingers blur into a chaotic swarm of black and white noise. I tried to clench my fist, but the movement was lagged, like a bad satellite feed from the outer rim. When I touched the bedside table, my fingers didn't hit the wood. They passed through the surface with a soft electronic hiss, leaving a trail of shimmering interference in the air. Static drift. I'd seen it happen to a dozen debtors during my years at the bank. It was the physical manifestation of spiritual erosion, the slow-motion erasure of a person who had become collateral. The Gilded Root didn't just own my soul on a piece of paper. They were beginning to uninstall me from reality. I rubbed the bridge of my nose with my right hand, the one that still felt like meat and bone, and felt a cold, hollow vacuum where my heartbeat should have been. I wasn't just a line item anymore. I was a glitch in the system. I stumbled out into the main barn, the floorboards creaking under my boots. The llamas were there, gathered in a loose circle, their wool shimmering under the hydroponic lamps. Balthazar the Bold stood at the center, his head tossed high, humming a low, resonant frequency that vibrated in the soles of my feet. I remembered what Zenzal had said about rhythmic synchronization. If I could just align my frequency with theirs, maybe I could anchor myself back to the physical plane. I closed my eyes and tried to find the beat, reaching for that syncopated pulse that drove the herd. But panic is a dissonant instrument. Every time I tried to slip into the groove, my desperation spiked, creating a jarring, screeching frequency that tore through the music. Balthazar stopped humming abruptly and let out a sharp, indignant bleat. He stepped back, his dark eyes wide with a mixture of pity and disgust. The other llamas shifted away from me, their ears flopping low. I was a broken record, a scratched disc, and my presence was polluting the harmony of the room. The more I fought to belong, the more the static surged, climbing from my wrist to my elbow, then leaping across my shoulder. I looked down and saw my collarbone dissolving into a swarm of flickering pixels. I reached up to touch my shoulder, but there was no sensation of skin. There was only a humming emptiness, a void that felt like a freezing wind blowing through a tunnel. I wasn't feeling the air, I was feeling the absence of myself. I sank to my knees on the damp concrete, the gray noise of my arm casting a flickering light against the floor. I felt like a ghost haunting my own body, a passenger in a vehicle that was being dismantled while I was still driving it. "The degradation is remarkably linear," a voice observed. "Almost textbook." I jerked my head to the right. Yuki Tanaka was leaning against a support beam, her expression clinical and detached. She held a sketchbook in one hand and a silver-inked pen in the other, her eyes darting between my flickering shoulder and the paper. She wasn't looking at me with sympathy, she was documenting a specimen. Her pen moved in rapid, shimmering trails, capturing the exact geometry of my decay. To her, I wasn't a man losing his existence. I was a fascinating sociological data point in a thesis on organic obsolescence. "Get out," I rasped. My voice sounded thin, as if it were being filtered through a long-distance line with a bad connection. "I can't do that," Yuki replied, her delivery rapid-fire and devoid of inflection. "The archival record requires a first-hand account of spiritual liquidation. You are the first specimen in this sector to exhibit drift while still inhabiting a physical residence. It's a rare intersection of bureaucracy and biology. I glared at her, my static arm glitching violently, sending a spray of grayscale sparks onto the concrete. Is there a way to stop this, or are you just here to draw my autopsy? Yuki paused, her pen hovering over the page. Depends on what you mean by stop. If you want to remain a discrete entity, you'll need a tether. Your Uncle Kavi understood this. He spent years researching the intersection of lunar calligraphy and soul architecture. I froze. Kavi? The will said he vanished. That he drifted. Vanished is a relative term, Yuki said, stepping closer. She didn't look at my face, but at the way the static was eating into my chest. He didn't simply disappear into the void. He became a permanent, sentient part of the farm's ledger architecture. He didn't leave the property, he merged with it. He is the soil, the pipes, and the very ink and the dust you've been struggling to write with. I felt a surge of nausea. I had spent the last few days thinking of Kavi as a tragic figure, a man lost to the currents of the arc. But the reality was worse. He hadn't died, he had been archived. He was a ghost in the machine, a consciousness partitioned into a series of balance sheets and asset logs. He was a living death, a consciousness stripped of agency and turned into a corporate record. The Gilded Root hadn't just taken his life, they had turned his soul into a filing system. Why are you telling me this? I asked, the void in my chest pulsing with a rhythmic, freezing cold. Because curiosity is a powerful motivator, Yuki replied. She turned her sketchbook around to show me a page. It wasn't a drawing of me, but a complex, swirling pattern of silver calligraphy, a series of interlocking loops and jagged strikes that seemed to vibrate on the paper. This is the forbidden chord. It's a pattern of rhythmic calligraphy designed to rewrite the terms of a soul contract. If you can manifest this in the lunar-dust, you can shift your status from collateral back to owner, or at least you can stop the drift. Desperation flared in my gut. I reached out with my left hand to grab the book, to pull the secret closer to me. But as my fingers approached the paper, they didn't grip the edge. They glitched. My hand passed right through the sketchbook as if it were a hologram, the silver ink shimmering through my transparent skin without any physical contact. I tried again, my movements frantic, but I was just a ghost reaching for a world that no longer recognized me as solid. I slumped back against the beam, staring at my flickering hand. The silver ink of the forbidden chord felt like the only thing in the universe that mattered, and I was becoming too transparent to touch it. Then the static in my own ear shifted. It wasn't the white noise of the drift anymore. The interference coalesced, sharpening into a voice that sounded like a dying radio station, crackling with interference and distant wind. It wasn't coming from the room, it was coming from inside my own head, vibrating through the parts of me that were already gone. Kaelen, the voice whispered, airy and distorted. It was Kavi. Don't look at the ink. Listen to the ground. The board is coming for the soil tonight. Chapter 8. The slum council didn't meet in a boardroom, they met in a repurposed ventilation hub that smelled of static crackle and rotting hydroponic kale. 12 counselors sat in a semicircle of mismatched plastic chairs, their faces illuminated by the flickering amber glow of a dying neon sign that once advertised pure oxygen. Zenzile stood in the center of the hub, her posture a rigid vertical line against the slouching decay of the room. Beside her, Balthazar the Bold stood in a theatrical pose, chest puffed out, his wool shimmering with a faint, iridescent sheen that suggested he'd spent the morning grooming for a coronation. The Gilded Root sees a deficit, Zenzile began, her voice carrying a rhythmic cadence, a syncopation that made the counselors lean in despite themselves. They see a line item, a liability. But look at the resonance of this sector. Listen to the silence between the beats. She signaled to Balthazar. The llama didn't just hum, he released a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through the metal grating of the floor, a sound that felt like a warm blanket draped over a cold shiver. It wasn't just music, it was a structural argument. The sound filled the gaps in the counselors' weary expressions, pulling a momentary, visceral harmony from a room built on discord. One of the counselors, a man whose skin looked like cured leather and who wore a vest made of salvaged fiber-optic cables, squinted through a cloud of synthetic cigar smoke. Cultural value doesn't pay the air tax, Mbeki. The RootNet wants this soil for a server hub. That's jobs. That's stability. Stability is the death of the spirit, Zenzile countered, her fingers tapping a complex polyrhythm against her thigh. If you let the RootNet swallow the farm, you aren't getting jobs, you're getting a digital tomb. We aren't asking for a handout, We are proposing a charter. A rhythmic accounting school. We turn the farm into a sanctuary for the arts of the ledger, where the music preserves the math. The farm becomes a cultural trust, a separate legal entity. The debt stays with the soil, but the school belongs to the people. I leaned against a rusted support beam in the shadows, my body flickering like a bad transmission. Every few seconds, my left arm would vanish into a cloud of gray static, leaving a void where my elbow should be. It was a dizzying, nauseating sensation, like being erased by a slow-motion rubber. I watched Zenziel work the rune, her idealism acting as a shield against the cynicism I'd spent a lifetime perfecting. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the urge to interject with a reminder about the inevitable cruelty of the board. I just watched her, feeling a strange, cooling pride in my chest. A sensation that didn't feel like a debt being called in, but a dividend finally paid. A charter, the leather-skinned man mused, the smoke curling around his head like a halo of smog. The board hates charters. They hate anything they can't quantify in a spreadsheet. That's why we make it quantifiable, Zenziel said, her voice dropping an octave, landing with the weight of a gavel. We prove that the harmonic output of the herd increases the efficiency of the surrounding hydroponics. We don't fight the math. We change the rhythm of the equation. After an hour of rhythmic pleading and Balthazar providing a sonic backdrop that felt like a heartbeat for the entire sector, the council relented. They signed the charter with shaking hands on a piece of digital vellum, granting the school legal sanctuary. Zenziel exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate her entire frame. She had won a victory in the mud, a small piece of heaven carved out of a corporate wasteland. But the victory lasted exactly as long as it took for the world to scream. It started as a low rumble that rattled the teeth in my skull. Then, a sound like 1,000 sheets of metal being torn in half erupted from the center of the hydroponic sector. I lunged toward the window of the hub, my hand glitching through the frame before I could grip it. Outside, a massive root net spire, a jagged obsidian needle of circuitry and cold light, had erupted from the earth. It hadn't been built. It had been deployed, punching through the soil and the irrigation pipes with a violent surgical precision. The spire pulsed once, a wave of oppressive, sterile blue light that washed over the district, and then the world went dark. The blackout was absolute. The neon signs died. The hum of the ventilation system vanished, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like water. The lunar dust in the air, usually a shimmering haze, suddenly went inert, falling to the ground like gray ash. The power was gone, and with it, the only thing keeping the farm's life support systems breathing. In the sudden gloom, the llamas began to panic. The herd, usually a bastion of jazz-infused dignity, devolved into a chaotic sea of bleats and frantic hoofbeats. The dark felt predatory, as if the root net spire were a giant vacuum sucking the soul out of the sector. I felt my own stability slipping further. Without the ambient energy of the sector, the static in my limbs grew louder, a buzzing roar that threatened to dissolve me into a cloud of white noise. Then Balthazar stepped forward. He didn't panic. He didn't flee. He planted his hooves firmly into the dirt and let out a low, defiant frequency, a sound that didn't just travel through the air, but through the very floorboards of the barn. It was a grounding chord, a deep earthen vibration that acted as an anchor for the rest of the herd. The other llamas stopped their pacing, their ears twitching, slowly aligning their breathing to Balthazar's rhythm. Balthazar turned his head toward me, his eyes reflecting the distant cold blue of the spire. He didn't speak in a language I could translate with my ears, but the resonance hit me in the marrow of my bones. We no longer play for the bank's approval, the frequency seemed to say. We no longer dance to the board's rules. We play for the soil.I. I looked down at my wrist, my hand instinctively reaching to check a watch that had been gone for years. I stopped. The habit of counting down the seconds to failure, the habit of negotiating the terms of my own surrender, it suddenly felt absurd. I was a ghost in a dying city, and I was spending my last moments calculating the probability of loss. Fine, I muttered, the word sounding like gravel in a blender. If we're going down, we're doing it on our own tempo. I knew the root net architecture better than anyone. I'd spent half my career auditing the backdoors Thanhung when used to hide his inefficiencies. Closing my eyes, I reached out into the digital ether, searching for the ghost signals of the spire's deployment. I found a vulnerability, a flickering synchronization gap in the spire's initial handshake with the sector's grid. It was a narrow window, a hairline fracture in the corporate armor. I shoved my consciousness into that gap, forcing a feedback loop that diverted a trickle of power back toward the farm. I felt the effort rip through me. It wasn't a physical strain, it was an existential one. I could feel my edges fraying, the static consuming my chest and shoulders as I acted as a living bridge for the electricity. A shimmering, translucent shield flickered into existence around the barn, a dome of pale gold light that hummed with a frantic, unstable energy. I slumped against the wall, gasping, my vision swimming in gray pixels. I was barely more than a suggestion of a person now, a smudge of charcoal on a white canvas. But as the shield stabilized, the silence of the blackout was broken by a new sound. At the gates of the farm, the blue light of the spire illuminated a procession of figures. They weren't the lawyers in charcoal suits, or the auditors with their digital clipboards. They were the board's enforcers, clad in matte black armor that absorbed all light. And they weren't carrying subpoenas. They were hauling massive, humming canisters, soul-vacuuming machinery designed for total liquidation. They didn't want the balance sheet anymore. They wanted the essence of everything that made the farm alive. Chapter 9. The chrome dais didn't land so much as puncture the silence, descending from the smoggy heights of the Aurelian Arc like a polished surgical needle. It hovered above the mud and hydroponic runoff, a mirrored disk reflecting the filth of the slums in high definition. 5 figures sat atop it, the board of directors, draped in silks that cost more than the sector's decade-long oxygen allotment. They looked at me as if I were a stubborn stain on a white carpet. Kaelen, the central director, spoke, his voice a synthesized chime that vibrated directly in the sinuses. The grace period has expired. The audit is closed. Surrender the title, the livestock, and your spiritual equity to the Gilded Root Bank. Now. I rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling the grit of lunar dust embedded in my skin. I looked at Balthazar. The llama stood in an operatic pose, chest puffed, wool shimmering with an iridescent sheen. He wasn't looking at the board. He was watching the lunar dust swirling around our ankles like sentient fog. I felt the charcoal smudge of my own existence, the grayscale blur of my limbs, and realized I had no bureaucratic loopholes left. I had only the rhythm. The balance sheet is ready, I said, my voice sounding like nails dropped on concrete. But it's not a document. It's a performance. Senzil stepped forward, fingers tapping a complex polyrhythm against a rusted hydroponic tank. The synchronization is primed, Kaelen. Don't lead him, just follow the pocket. I stepped into the center of the barn, the air thick with the tang of suspended dust. Balthazar let out a resonant hum that rattled the floorboards. I knelt, dipping my fingers into the silver powder, and began to draw. I used the rigid geometry of the Gilded Root's accounting standards, the precise angles of a debt cycle and the loops of compound interest, but I left the ends open. I created a skeletal structure of corporate greed, a cage of ink and dust, and waited for the music to fill the gaps. Balthazar hit the first note. It was a physical displacement of air, a brassy roar that tore through the silence. As the sound hit the dust, the rigid lines began to vibrate. The bureaucratic structure didn't break, it began to swing. The jazz didn't fight the accounting, it inhabited it. I felt the rhythm enter my marrow, a syncopated pulse demanding movement. I sketched faster, adding flourishes and chromatic diversions to the ledger. We were building a financial instrument out of sound and silver, a living balance sheet, where debt was the melody and payment was the harmony. The iridescent dust rose in a vortex, forming glowing equations that evolved with Balthazar's improvisations. The board members leaned forward, their sterile expressions flickering with terror. They recognized the math. It was a system that had stopped serving the bank and started serving itself. "Silence it," the central director shrieked. "Deploy the silence frequency, now!" From the root-net spire looming over the farm, a wave of colorless energy slammed down. It was the corporate equivalent of a gag order. The music was murdered. The sudden vacuum caused the lunar dust to react violently, the glow snapping into a jagged neon purple. Gravity failed. The barn floor tilted 45 degrees, then flipped. I was slammed against the ceiling, my body feeling like a smudge of charcoal smeared across a wet canvas. I am disappearing, I thought, the panic tasting like static. The static drift was pulling me into the gray.is. If I let go of the rhythm, I wouldn't just be bankrupt. I would be a rounding error in a ledger that didn't want me. I could see the void opening behind the board's dais, the hungry space where the Gilded Root kept the things it had liquidated. I refused to be a footnote in Tan Hung Nguyen's promotion portfolio. I looked down, or up, and saw Balthazar. He was suspended in midair, legs kicking, but his eyes were locked on mine. He wasn't panicked. He was holding a note in the back of his throat, a silent vibration resisting the silence frequency. He was waiting for the bridge. I reached out with the fragment of my will, grabbed the volatile energy of the disrupted dust, and shoved it into the center of the broken ledger. I didn't try to fix the math, I broke it further. I pushed the debt into a recursive loop, a paradox where the interest paid the principal and the principal fed the interest, a closed circuit of infinite value. "Now!" I screamed, the word a whisper of static. Balthazar unleashed the forbidden chord. It was a sound that shouldn't exist in a three-dimensional universe, a collision of a perfect fifth and a dissonant void. The shockwave rippled outward in a sphere of blinding silver light. It hit the root net spire first, the massive structure shattering like a glass vase. The spire dissolved into a rain of digital sparks. On the chrome dais, the board members screamed. The legal contracts they held, the foreclosure notices and soul seizure warrants physically incinerated. The black letters lifted off the parchment and morphed into thousands of shimmering silver butterflies that fluttered into the smoggy sky, carrying the debt with them. Tan Nguyen was thrown from the dais as it lost its anchor. He hit the mud with a wet thud, his pristine suit ruined by the filth of the sector he had tried to erase. He lay there gasping, staring at the ruins of the spire. His world of surgical precision had been dismantled by a llama and a burnt-out bailiff playing a song that didn't follow the rules. I slumped back against the wreckage of the barn, my body regaining its color. Balthazar landed beside me with a theatrical huff, tossing his head to flip his wool. He studied the ruins of the corporate machinery and let out a satisfied bleat. I looked at my wrist. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to check the time. The debt was gone, rewritten into a self-sustaining endowment belonging to the soil. But as the dust settled, I noticed a pulsing fissure in the center of the barn floor. From that crack, something was climbing out. Something that looked exactly like my Uncle Kavi, but his eyes were glowing with the cold blue light of the root net. Chapter 10. Chapter title, The Dissonant Piece. The blue-eyed thing that looked like my uncle didn't scream. It just stood in the center of the barn floor, half emerged from a fissure that smelled of static and old libraries, staring at me with eyes like cold LED displays. My legs felt like wet cardboard. I stood there rubbing the bridge of my nose, waiting for the universe to tell me this was a hallucination brought on by the silver light. "You always did have a penchant for the dramatic, Kaelen," the thing said. The voice was Kavi's, that airy, static-laced whisper. But it lacked the warmth of the man who taught me to cheat at cards using lunar-dust. This was a recording played through a broken speaker. It was the root net, wearing my uncle's skin like a cheap suit. Balthazar stepped forward, his wool still shimmering from the forbidden chord. He let out a low, vibrating hum that rattled the floorboards. He didn't look afraid, he looked offended, as if the root net had committed a grave rhythmic error by appearing so clumsily. "It's a projection," I said, my voice rough. A feedback loop. The spire collapsed, but the data found a hole. The thing tilted its head, mirroring a gesture from my childhood. "Data does not vanish, Kaelen. It merely reindexes. You've created a paradox. A self-sustaining endowment. Do you have any idea how much the bank hates a loop they cannot tax?" A sharp, wet cough echoed from the mud outside. I turned to see Tan Nguyen. He looked like he'd been dragged through a sewage plant, his bespoke charcoal suit plastered with gray sludge. He leaned against a piece of charred debris, staring at the projection with clinical horror. For a man who worshipped efficiency, a physical glitch was a religious crisis. "The audit is incomplete," Thon whispered. He looked small. For the first time, he looked like a man who realized he was just a cog in a machine that had decided to grind him down. I walked over to him, boots crunching on glass shards. I didn't offer a hand. I'd spent years as a bailiff, stripping the assets of those who failed the system. Seeing the system's golden boy stripped bare should have felt like victory, but it just felt like more noise. "Go home, Thon. The debt is gone. The farm is a sanctuary now. The bank can't touch it without admitting they lost a fight to a llama." Thon finally looked up, eyes bloodshot. "They won't let it stand. A legal anomaly of this magnitude is a cancer in the ledger. They will send someone who doesn't care about the rules of engagement." He wasn't lying. People like Thon were most honest when defeated. He stayed in the sector for the next few days because he had nowhere else to go. The Gilded Root Bank eventually recognized the farm as a protected sanctuary of rhythmic accounting, a bureaucratic compromise that allowed them to save face. To contain the anomaly, they appointed Thon as the reluctant administrator of the endowment. He became the keeper of the very thing he had tried to liquidate. 2 weeks later, the barn had been scrubbed of the static smell, though a soft luminescence now clung to the walls. Zenzio had turned the east wing into a classroom. It was a chaotic, beautiful sight. Humans from the lower sectors sitting cross-legged on the floor, pencils poised over lunar-dust parchment, while 2 llamas hummed a complex 7/4 signature. Zenzile moved between them like a conductor. "No, no," she exclaimed. "You're treating the credit column like a fence. It's a bridge. Feel the syncopation. The balance isn't a zero, it's a resolution. Balthazar, give them the bridge." Balthazar let out a resonant, brassy note that physically pushed the air. The students gasped, their pens moving in fluid arcs of silver. They weren't just doing accounting, they were composing a financial symphony. I watched from the porch, leaning against a railing that smelled of fresh cedar and old rain. My body felt solid again, though a faint silver shimmer lingered in the iris of my left eye, a souvenir from the void. I felt the phantom weight of my wrist. For 20 years, my life had been governed by the ticking of a clock, and the precise second a soul was due for collection. I started to raise my arm to check the time, then stopped. I let my hand drop and listened to the wind whistling through the hydroponic vents, harmonizing with the distant thrum of the ark's engines. Balthazar approached me with a quiet, measured grace. He didn't bleat, he simply let out a soft, respectful hum that settled in my chest. It was an acknowledgement. He recognized me not as a clumsy student, but as a fellow conductor of the chaos. "Yeah," I muttered, scratching him behind the ears. "Harmony isn't about the silence. It's about how you arrange the noise." As Balthazar wandered back to the students, I noticed a weathered envelope tucked into a crevice of the porch railing. It smelled of cinnamon and old static. I opened it with trembling fingers. It was a letter from Uncle Kavi, dated years before he vanished. "Kaelen," it read in a sprawling script. "If you're reading this, you've probably stopped trying to balance the books with a ruler. The secret to the dust isn't precision, it's surrender. I spent my whole life counting seconds, thinking I could outrun the drift. I hope you've learned to stop counting and start listening." I folded the letter into my pocket and looked out over the neon slums, where the purple and green lights of the city bled into the twilight. For a moment, the world felt quiet. It felt like a peace I had earned. Then, the air in my pocket vibrated. I pulled out my handheld comms unit. There was no caller ID, just a string of hexadecimal code that made my stomach drop. It was a high-priority signal from the upper spires. I didn't answer. The signal wasn't a call, it was a beacon. As I looked up at the shimmering towers of the elite, I saw a single, cold white light pulsing in rhythm with the heartbeat of the city. The bank hadn't forgotten the anomaly. They had simply stopped trying to audit it and started hunting it.